right, everybody, welcome back to day 3 of NASCAR, the NASCAR antitrust trial going on here in Charlotte, North Carolina. My name is Jeff Gluck. I'm along with Jordan Bianchi. We're motorsports writers for The Athletic. Now, today we picked up where we left off yesterday with testimony from Scott Prime, the executive vice president at NASCAR, who heads the strategy side of things. And he started the day still under the direct examination, right? And then they got to cross, or we started cross. My days are all coming together, but we have lots and lots and lots of notes today, Jordan.
Lots of notes every day. I don't know what you're talking about.
This was a big one, though. This felt like a big day, and this is going to take a while. But good thing for us, and you guys all let us know that you did not want these podcasts to be shorter, and guess what? It's not going to be. So this is going to be most likely an hour, I would say, and we plan to be joined again by our friend Shannon McMenemy toward the end of this to give her impressions of what she heard, reacting to what our notes are here. So I guess we'll just go right into it, Jordan.
Let's do it. So do you just want me to start rattling off some numbers here?
Well, so Scott Prime resumed back on the stand, and he was asked about this report from a place called McKinsey, a global consulting firm, essentially.
That he used to work for.
Mm-hmm. And he was working for this firm when he did a report on behalf of NASCAR, because the teams had come to NASCAR and they're like, our finances are bad. You need to help us do whatever is eventually, going to change the business model, which turned out to be the charter system, right? And they said, look into this, talk to the teams, get their finances, come back to us and do this report. So Scott Prime, who now works for NASCAR, at the time was working for McKinsey. So this McKinsey report that he was a part of expressed his, quote, concerns over the longevity of the sport, because teams on average, they found, were losing $1.3 million per car. They lost $85 million total a year, I guess. And one thing that he has proposal in there is long-term medallions, which if anybody's been to New York City, or that they have these taxi cab medallions, right? So in order to have like a cab license in New York City for many years, they had these taxi medallions. And so the original charter system name was, they were talking about medallions that you could buy and then have a license to use this, right? So they talk about how he was at McKinsey during this. So this comes back later, right? This comes back to be information that Jeffrey Kessler wants to use. I guess, do you have anything first that you want to?
No, I don't know how you want to do this. So.
So I'll keep going here. I'm going to move on to the Roush Fenway letter. Is that where you're at in your notes, or?
No, I mean, he's got the numbers. He said that the study and everything.
Okay, go ahead.
The study at the time, they interviewed 20 teams. They went through the team's finances and everything. They determined that there was $84 million combined in losses, and that for the health of the sport going forward, as they're kind of examining, charter models and what to do, they determined that teams needed sure starting spots. There was too much uncertainty economically for the teams. And then he shortly thereafter joined NASCAR in late 2015, just as the charter agreement was starting to kind of get finalized, which would go into place for the 2016 season.
Okay, so the 2016 charters, that's the original charters, they get signed, right?
Yep.
Now we're coming up to the 2020 charters, because the first charters were supposed to last for 5 years. Okay. So in 2019, Roush Fenway Racing, before it was RFK, sends a letter to NASCAR. They say, listen, man, this charter system, appreciate that, but we need to create a business model that has a lot more sustainability and viability for the teams. The current model is not sustainable. We need NASCAR to evaluate and present a new proposal for this next charter negotiation deal that's coming up. NASCAR ultimately says, no, we're not going to change anything. They didn't increase the TV payout from the first one. They didn't do a proposed track scorecard that they were talking about, holding the tracks accountable. They basically didn't do anything according to the testimony we heard. So Jeffrey Kessler, the team's attorney, argued that even back then, that was essentially a take it or leave it deal, which, Scott Prime didn't agree with those terms. And he said, we presented the offer and they accepted it. And Jeffrey Kessler said, well, you're a monopoly. There's no place else to compete. There's no place else for them to go, correct? And Scott Prime said, NASCAR is the premier stock car racing series today. Yes. And again, Jeffrey Kessler was drawing that back to the McKinsey report that Scott Prime was part of, where he said he had concerns over longevity of the sport if they don't help the teams. Then they get to the next agreement and they don't help the teams. It's essentially, when Roush Fenway said we need help, that was point one from Jeffrey Kessler today. Go ahead.
You jumped ahead to the letter that Newmark sent, right?
Yes.
Okay, and that was in February 2024, right?
No, this was the 2019 letter.
All right.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I'm trying to go in order. Did I go too far?
No, you're good. You're fine.
Okay. I'm up to the Goodwill agreement.
Okay.
Do you want to respond or react to any?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. It's so we have just pages and pages of notes, folks. Handwritten stuff. We're just out of trial. It's tough to coordinate all this, but we'll try to keep persisting here. All right. So the next point that Jeffrey Kessler wants to make to Scott Prime is this protection of goodwill, right? So NASCAR, this has been a thing so far. It's already come up several times. Let's talk about it really quick. So NASCAR has this provision in their agreements called the goodwill provision. I'm putting this in air quotes, right? Now this goodwill provision essentially says that if you own a NASCAR team, or in fact, if you even own 10% of a NASCAR team, you're a very small minority owner, you are not allowed to race in a competing series or even invest in another series, even if you're a 10% owner, a competing stock car series, right? So Jeffrey Kessler says this is a non-compete. He says, why is this called the goodwill provision? This is a non-compete clause. What is goodwill about not letting a team to go into another series? It's not goodwill, it's anti-competitive will. Shouldn't that be the better name? Of course, NASCAR then objected to this, and that was sustained. But there was a provision for a while. Now, again, this was changed. This was something NASCAR went back and changed. We found out later. But at the time, there was even a clause that says if a team leaves NASCAR, and even if they give their charter back, they cannot go to another competitor series for a year. And Jeffrey Kessler said to Scott Prime, and you think that's goodwill? And Scott Prime said, I do. Next, I'll be on to the next gen car stuff after that. So what do you have on the goodwill?
No, go ahead, keep going.
All right, I'm sorry. Are you sure? I feel bad.
Keep going. All
right. So next gen car, the IP restrictions, right? So IP means intellectual property. Okay. And Scott Prime, they present a memo that Scott Prime wrote, a strategy memo, and he's talking about how they're in the next gen, they're in the Gen 6 car era now, right? And they're like, man, we don't have enough intellectual property protections on this car. Although Scott Prime, it was a little bit hard to follow because he said that he did think there was some legal protections on the Gen 6 car, but we weren't shown any evidence of that. But he testified that there was. But anyway, he wrote that because there's limited IP protection on the Gen 6 car, that increases the risk to NASCAR of the creation of a copycat series. Our concern is we have no protection on the vehicle. We need to avoid copycats in the marketplace. When the next gen car came along, NASCAR put language in the rule book that says you can't race these cars anywhere but in a NASCAR event, right? Now, Scott Prime says, listen, during the next gen creation process, this was never an issue with the teams. They wanted to make sure the parts were protected. They understood the next gen car design and all the protections that went with it. He said, our vehicle is our intellectual property. That's NASCAR's property. Jeffrey Kessler says, well, I mean, you could have protected the intellectual property from the rest of the world, but license your teams to use it wherever they want. That's his contention. There was a funny moment where, they say he's asked, have you read the NASCAR rule book, Scott Prime? And he says, it's hundreds of pages. I don't think anybody's read the whole rule book. Jeffrey Kessler said, I don't think anybody's read the whole thing. Bob has, you have, right?
Yeah, we've all looked. I looked.
I
at
haven't
Bob.
read the whole.
I looked at Bob immediately and started laughing.
Yeah. All right. So please, if
no,
you
go
want
ahead. Keep going.
Oh, I feel. Will you flag me motion then if you want to shut in or anything? I feel bad. I'm just rolling here. Anyway, the rule book says that you can use the NextGen car only for the sole purpose of competing in NASCAR sanctioned events unless otherwise approved by NASCAR in writing. So then there's another document. This document's called High Priority Items for the 2025 Charters. This is stuff they wanted to get in the charter agreement that they did get in. Allow the France family to have ownership of charters. That's one thing that got in. Strengthen protection of the Goodwill or non-compete clause, depending on which side you're on, to extend it to other motorsports, right? And there's something we haven't gotten into yet, Jordan, called the 3 strikes rule.
Yes.
The elimination of the 3 strikes rule. This was new information to us, I think, on the first night of the podcast. We've since learned more about what this is. Do you want to go into that?
I am trying to find the notes. So if you want to go ahead and explain, then I'll.
So in the original charter agreement, when NASCAR would propose a rules change, okay, they'd say, all right, you know what? We're thinking of doing this, okay? And it's probably going to cost you guys a lot of money. So the teams, they couldn't overrule it, but they would vote on it. This team owner council got to vote on a potential change. Now, if they voted no 3 times on NASCAR suggested changes, they had the ability to reject changes going forward, right?
Yeah.
So NASCAR basically had to present changes then that they knew weren't going to get strikes on them. Well, in the new charter agreement, NASCAR eliminated the 3 strikes rule. And so now the teams have no chance to push back on any changes that NASCAR could want to make and say, hey, this new part is going to cost you whatever. That was taken out.
Yes. The rule, reading this text here, this rule was eliminated from the 2025 charter agreement without a comparable replacement, leaving the teams without any say in material changes. Under the 2016 charter, NASCAR and the charter agreement, NASCAR would have to come to terms with the teams on a material change to at least have a discussion. This does not exist in the 2025 charter agreement.
So there you go. Now, Jordan, we're up to the February 2024 letter from the teams. Then this is where it starts to get really juicy, my friends. This is where it starts to get juicy.
You get very excited.
Well, we're trying to explain the long day in court. Do you want to go over this letter first? Or you want me to do it and you react, or what?
I mean, you want to rotate on how you say it? Or do you got the quotes from the owner? Is that what we're talking about? Where
I have that coming up.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So the teams send a letter. Now, all along, this has been reported that the teams had these 4 pillars, right? They had these 4 pillars, Jordan.
Yes.
That the team negotiating committee from pretty much the start, I think, right, of the negotiations 2022 had these 4 pillars that they absolutely had to have in the new charter agreement. And one of these was evergreen charters, I believe, right? That's one of the pillars.
Correct. Anyway, charters, yep.
So they, on February 2024, they send a letter to NASCAR that Scott Prime writes to the fellow executives was, quote, quite disappointing because these 4 pillars were still in it. They wanted 45% of the revenue, with nothing coming out of that for the DAP program that we talked about last night, how some teams didn't want that. They wanted the evergreen / permanent / perpetual charters or whatever, some sort of permanence to the charters. They wanted 30% of all new NASCAR revenue, regardless of whether the team intellectual property was used. And the team's right here. In the event NASCAR is not in agreement, the teams will be forced to recommit our energy to exploring all of our options. And this is where the concern from NASCAR comes about a breakaway series. So Scott Prime then writes to a smaller group of NASCAR executives, and he says, we need to think about how we're going to deliver this news and how hard of the hole we want to go. We need to explore all our options, right? So here's some of the options that NASCAR considered going to in reaction to this letter from the teams that said they were considering all options. Where NASCAR took that as a threat, like, oh, you're considering leaving. Okay, so now what do we do in response to this? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
So option number one, they say they're going to go down to 32 charters and create a first come, first serve situation. If they did that, as you can imagine, some team they're hoping might panic and say, crap, there's only 32 charters now. Let's just sign or we're going to lose them. We're going to be left out. Musical chairs, right? That was one option. Option number two, update the charter draft to our liking and give a deadline to sign and otherwise offer a deal to anyone else who might be willing to accept it. Jeffrey Kessler says that language right there, update the charter draft to our liking and give them a deadline to sign or else they lose it. He says that's what became the September 6th infamous deadline. Now, Scott Prime says no. He'll go on to say, no, that's not true. But that's what Jeffrey Kessler wants to come back to. Okay, so another option was combine option 1 and 2, go to 32 charters and give them a deadline. Another option was just get rid of the charters. Buy charter system. All right, fine. You know what? You're evaluating all your options. Oh, there's no more charters. We're not doing that anymore. And the other one was the, again, now infamous gold codes, which we've talked about that in previous podcasts. The gold codes were for NASCAR to take all the teams and cars in-house themselves and say, we're going to just run everything ourselves and we won't need teams anymore. So we don't even need to deal with charters because we will, just like SRX did, right? Here's all the cars.
Yep. We're going to run everything ourselves
Yeah.
in-house. We're going to own the cars. We're going to build the cars. We're going to pay the drivers. We're going to pay the crews. It's going to be a more condensed, scaled down team version, if you will. But that would all be in-house. And then later they go into the cost of that too.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
Phelps, let's get to Phelps' response really quick because Steve Phelps responded to this email and said, thanks for pulling this together. You accurately reflected our options. They are playing with fire. There's lots of options, but they all have the same theme. Pick a date and they can sign or lose their charters. It's that simple. So we've seen that letter before. We've seen that from Steve Phelps, but that is the context now to what happens. And Jeffrey Kessler gets animated here. He says, only a monopolist could say such a thing. Only a monopolist has the power to say they're going to go to someone else and say, you're going to someone and say, take my offer. And if you don't take it, you will no longer be in this business and someone else will take your place. So that was the point that Jeffrey Kessler was trying to make on that one. Jordan?
I'm listening. Keep going.
Okay. Now we get to the chart, which is known as the Amanda chart, which is named after NASCAR counsel Amanda Oliver, I believe is her last name.
She is the NASCAR in-house legal counsel.
And this is where the original dump where Steve Phelps said, look at the Amanda chart, no wins for teams. You've heard that before probably as part of this coverage. So the Amanda chart compared changes between the versions of the charter agreement. And she marked them neutral, NASCAR win, or team win. Steve Phelps recalls, he says there's no wins for the teams here. Jeffrey Kessler says actually there was 25 items and there was one win for the teams. But he asked Scott Prime here on the stand, now, so who decided not to make a more moderate proposal after there was no wins for teams? Scott Prime says, well, it was our board of directors. And Jeffrey Kessler says, but that's Jim France. You've referred to the board as Jim, basically. Scott Prime says, no, it's the board of directors, right? So then Jeffrey Kessler says, aha, well, here's a text. May 20th, 2024. You sent this text that says, no bueno with Jim on charters. I can say OD and I, OD being Steve O'Donnell, put our best foot forward, but it was a brick wall. Steve Phelps wrote back to this text and said, I'm sorry to hear this, super disappointing. I noticed, by the way, Jordan, at this part in the proceedings, Denny Hamlin then leans forward and he looks over at the France family to try to see their reaction, which they were sitting there quite stone-faced. They really haven't shown any emotion. I keep looking at them.
Jim is taking notes, though.
So, Jordan, any reaction, other notes that you have to this?
It was interesting to watch Kessler tie this all together because he starts one way and he kind of brings this to light on the charter system back then and the cost and everything, and then lets it go and then kind of goes off down a road. And you're kind of wondering how this is going to be. And then we'll get there at the end, brings it all together and ties like a nice bow on it. It's really interesting to see just how a master class in lawyering this is, and just presentation and different inflections too of how, okay, this is a really important mode, so I'm gonna raise my voice really loud. And then there's times where it's confrontational. It's really interesting to watch. This is a guy who's one of the best for a reason. You can see it.
I agree with you, Jordan. I was sitting there today going, I don't know, this is a crazy comparison, but one of my favorite shows is Curb Your Enthusiasm. And there's a lot of time in episodes of Curb Your Enthusiasm where you're like, where are they going with this? How are these storylines related to each other? And at the end of many of the episodes, they somehow tie all the storylines together. And that's what it felt like Jeffrey Kessler was doing, right? You're sitting there going, why is he bringing up this memo or this thing, right? And then, as you said, he circles back around to it and he raises his voice and he makes this big dramatic moment. And you're like, oh, man. Okay, that's how he was crafting this narrative. It's very interesting to see.
We're going to talk about we talked about the gold codes, NASCAR considering all options, the $610 million.
Yeah, I have that a little bit later.
Okay.
Just a few things later. A few more things real quick. So they said that there was a chart of charter value growth. And the franchises on this chart are valued at 5 to 6 times revenue in leagues at the time. And Jeffrey Kessler says now it's even higher. And it was Scott Prime's view that if they had considered evergreen charters, that the charters would be worth more than $100 million. That was a email to Phelps in July 2022. Then there was an email to Phelps in June 2024 where he had played golf with this guy from JP Morgan. This has been something that was out there before. But and this guy said, this banker, he said he told Scott Prime he was very perplexed on why we wouldn't have permanent charters with ever-evolving economic and non-economic terms, and asked about this now. Scott Prime said he didn't understand the sport at all. So there's a key email here coming up right before your gold codes part, where there was an email between Prime and Phelps and Amanda Oliver. Amanda says she just talked to Jim and he would like to send out, this is right before the famous deadline in September. This was August 28th, 2024. So Jim wants to send out the revised draft of the charter agreement and the deadline for it, right? Prime says, this sounds good, but we need to probably strike a balance here on how we're going to word this to the teams, because we don't want to make it out like it's not, we don't want to have it like it's a gun to your head unless that's what we want. Kessler says, but that is what Jim wanted, isn't it? And Prime says, I don't know what he wanted. But Kessler, again, is going to tie this back and say, the gun to the head is what happened. So you can deny this and say this, but that is what happened, even though you said that's not what we want. That's what Jim wanted, okay? Now the gold codes part that you want to bring up.
Well, I was just going to say, NASCAR talked about the gold codes when we saw this, which was bring everything in-house. And the cost of that to go vertical, as they refer to it as, $610 million to start up, $500 million a year to run every year after that.
And what's interesting here that I have highlighted is they were talking about doing the gold codes as late as June 27th of last year. June 27th, 2024 was still an option that they could use. And Scott Prime says this was never seriously, looked at. It was one of the many options we wanted to understand the feasibility of. That's why they ran the numbers on it. Anyway, so that was the end of the direct examination. Now he gets cross-examination, but remember, he was an adverse witness for the plaintiffs. So the cross-examination he's getting, Scott Prime, is from NASCAR. This is going to be the softer part, right? The hard part for Scott Prime was being questioned by Jeffrey Kessler. The cross-examination, it's flipped because he's getting now the NASCAR attorneys, right? Do you want to?
No, go ahead.
All right,
I'm
sorry.
listening.
You're
rolling.
Scott Prime talks about how, listen, there was these teams, they overspent, right? Like there was the time in 2014 during their study where they saw that one team was spending $3 million a year to optimize their pit guns. And so if you give these teams money, he says NASCAR has no control over how much these teams are spending on money and or spending on their labor and their development. And he said their study from McKinsey at the time actually showed that the smaller teams were the ones making a profit. So he says that even though previously it said all these teams are losing money, he said actually 7 of 18 teams at the time were showing break even or better. It was some of the bigger teams that were weighing down the evaluation, the cost, right? Because they were spending so much money.
Well, that and personnel, that was the two things.
Yes.
It was research and development, engineering, that kind of thing. And it was also personnel, because the bigger teams have hundreds and hundreds of employees. They were the ones that were basically spending themselves beyond their means, where the more reasonable teams who were more budget conscientious were limiting themselves, and they were the ones that were turning a profit.
So Scott Prime writes an April 2022 email. He's writing and he says, it's very interesting. You look back at their original demands, the teams from the original charter negotiations back in 2016, and you see what they got. He says basically everything. So in the first, when charters didn't exist yet and they wanted to make the charter system, he says they got the charters, they got the field at 36, they got the guaranteed entry, they got the charters capped with no dilution of money. They got the ability to transfer them. They got a new payment system with buckets. They got the payouts linked to the TV deal. They had no change to the 25% of money. He says that's what the teams wanted. They got a team owner council with the 3 strikes rule. And they got the ability to take the contingency sponsor decals off the car so they could use it. So he says they got everything that they wanted at the time. It's very interesting to look back at that. Now, the teams, it was March 2022, and the negotiation window was supposed to open in July 2023. The teams tell Scott Prime and some others, we'd like to meet with you about this next media rights deal coming up. We want to know how to move the sport forward and all work together. Scott Prime sort of describes it as an ambush.
Yes.
Because he says he shows up and Curtis Polk, Jeff Gordon, Dave Alpern, and Steve Newmark from the team negotiating committee,
the 4 principals,
suddenly come up with a laundry list of things that are not working. He says Curtis Polk is more adversarial and confrontational than I would have thought.
That was their first meeting with him, really.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the first
contentious meeting.
He's the new Rob Kaufman, which is not meant as a compliment.
Rob Kaufman's the one that really pushed hard for the charter system and was a disruptor and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, and Rob within NASCAR circles, within NASCAR leadership circles, maybe doesn't have the best reputation or maybe not the most well liked. So when you say that someone is like Rob, that's what they're comparing him to in a lot of respects. they were going into this meeting. They had no expectation whatsoever. I think you can't be stated enough. There was no expectation whatsoever that they were going to talk about charters. It was about the media rights deal, what was going on. The charter window was not open to negotiate. That did not open until later in the summer. And so there was they didn't have their ducks in a row. They were waiting for the media rights deal to get down the road, and they don't have an idea about that. This was just a meeting of like, how you doing? What's going on? What's going? Anything we need to know about? Basically, a big touch base. This was not a contract negotiation. They walked in there and they were blindsided by this.
So after this meeting, the talk about the meeting, there's the NASCAR attorney does some sort of cleaning up with Scott Prime from his earlier comments, right? You remember Scott Prime had written that he wanted to lock up the Speedway Motorsports tracks, and he thought it was very important to lock them up. And Jeffrey Kessler took that as you want to exclude them from a competitor series, right? Scott Prime says, I just wanted to make sure we had them on our schedule. And he says he didn't mean for them that to be an exclusivity clause. That was not in his idea at all. He also denied taking any actions as a result of the Live Golf fears that were expressed. He also said that what the teams wanted, the $720 million, which is $20 million per charter, this is what they were asking for, right? He says that he was told by the NASCAR CFO, quote, it would put NASCAR bankrupt. Mm-hmm. So he says this was not at all feasible. He says France owning charters is not a big deal at all. If Penske owns teams in IndyCar, and he says that they often joke with the teams, if your business model is so bad, why would you be opposed to France's owning it? Then they'd get to see with you how bad it is. Why are you opposed to the France's owning charters? Scott Prime says. The cost cap, he says they're willing to spend every penny that comes in regardless of how much you give them. So let's see. Do you have any parts here that come in this part?
Nope, all you.
Okay. So he says, listen, there was a NASCAR, there was a narrative out there among the teams that at any point NASCAR could just terminate the charters. And he said that was not how we felt. We couldn't just push a button and make them go away. And he says, listen, the reason from his view, Scott Prime says, the reason you can't make these charters permanent is you can't negotiate a deal and have the exact same deal forever. You can't write a contract today that's going to last forever.
Yeah.
So he says that even though path number one, which we laid out earlier, the hardcore path of we're just going to ram this through and give him a deadline, all stuff, and that he thinks is not the path that was taken. He says that path number two, which he had written in that memo that wasn't disclosed before, which was an attempt to find common ground with the teams for their benefit. He says that was the path that NASCAR used. And he says, in fact, that was the path that Jim France also chose, he says.
And when he said that, by the way, both Denny Hamlin and Bob Jenkins shook their head like in disbelief.
Really? Okay, I missed that. Interesting. So he says that at this point in time, there's nothing, the exclusivity window expires with the teams without a deal. There was nothing stopping them from entering into agreements with other people, but they did it because they kept negotiating with the teams because they wanted to keep those teams. Let's see here. What else? Oh, Spire and Trackhouse sent a letter with some minor language that said
JGR too, by the way,
and JGR,
which is interesting because that is a TNC member.
Yes, and 2311 was opposed to this letter. This was in May 10th, 2024, and they said, "Listen, we would like to have some language in the new deal that says you can't, if you don't do a deal with us, you can't make a better offer to anyone else in the next charter window negotiation." And so it's kind of minor language, but that did make it into the charter deal. And so NASCAR is showing here that, hey, you're saying that we just rammed everything through and didn't give you anything. We did listen to Spire, Trackhouse, and JGR, this letter. We put that in there.
And at this point, too, it was reiterated. This is mid 2024. There was a lot of frustration from the NASCAR side of things. They had been working on a deal for 2 years about that time. They felt like they were making progress, and every time they kind of felt like one step forward, 2 steps back kind of thing. And the frustration, which is what goes back to the emails and texts we've seen over the last couple of days, some of that is coming from this, and that there was these meetings, there's failed negotiations, there was some frustration with Jim France. It was just, there was a bunch of frustration building up among the C-level on the NASCAR side.
So this part I'm going to tell you about. Now, it's not on the official record. But this is going to be important for the end of the podcast if you stick with us this long. So the testimony continues. This is right after the lunch break now, with Scott Prime texting with Jeff Dickerson. By the way, he says Jeff Dickerson is the one owner who was very favorable about the charter agreement. Now, these texts came up this morning before court started because there's hearsay in this, because Jeff Dickerson is not a witness. So the judge says, I will allow this as long as you generally vaguely refer to this without going into what Jeff Dickerson actually said in the text messages, because, and he said, I'm going to warn the jury when this comes up that you should not take anything that Jeff Dickerson says here as factual, because he's not here to testify about it. It's hearsay. So NASCAR then asks Scott Prime what he said. And Prime says that, Jeff Dickerson thought this deal was seriously fair, right? Well, that gets stricken from the record because the judge just said this morning, you can't say what he said exactly, because that's not, I don't want that entered as evidence when he's not a witness and here to say that for himself. So again, this comes, I'd say this is a small thing, but it comes up later. Okay. Another thing that Scott Prime says that they did change and listen to the teams. They said they removed the tail from the Goodwill provision. So that there was originally the non-compete clause that said you can't, even if you give your charge back, you can't go anywhere for a year and go race somewhere else for a year. So that's gone now. Now, if you leave NASCAR, if you want the next day, you can go race in a competitor series. So he says we did that for the teams also, right? Now, from Scott Prime's view, here comes the September 6th deadline, right? Scott Prime says, I thought we had all the open issues resolved and agreed to, so that when we were going to send the draft out, I thought we were good. I didn't think there was anything else left for the teams to be upset about. But he says we needed to have a date where we're moving forward or we're not.
Yeah, and it's really important to note this. This wasn't just like a sense that Scott Prime had. He had this from communication with other people, other team people, one of those being Jeff Gordon. And Jeff Gordon had basically said all the open issues had been resolved, indicating to NASCAR they were in a good spot. This was on September 5th, the day before the final offer.
Okay. He also shows that, and I'm going to sort of jump ahead a little bit here because these got refuted later. He presents a list of venues, a long list of venues, that he said would only take 6 months to a year to get ready if NASCAR chose to race there. And it wasn't specifically said to the jury, but the idea was...
It was heavily insinuated.
It was very much hinted that, see this list of places? You guys say we tied up all the tracks. Here's a whole list of places that a competitor series could go. It's
not just tying up the tracks, which they talked about, but it was also when Kessler was examining Prime, he laid it out of like, you're expect us to go watch tracks. You're going to do all these upkeeps. There's no other good tracks out there. There's no other good viable tracks out there. And this was NASCAR's counter, which was like, no, here's our list of places where we are interested in going that suit our standards. Or in the example of Bowman Gray, if it doesn't suit our standards, we go in there and with a little bit of money and in a few months, short months, we can have it spruced up to the point where we're comfortable racing there, which means any other startup series would theoretically be good to race there.
Well, so again, I'm jumping ahead just because this part gets directly addressed on the redirect examination. But basically, Jeffrey Kessler says, well, yeah, sure, you have this whole list. A lot of these are street courses. So you have this whole list. Surely you weren't insinuating that a startup league could go run these places. How much did you lose on the Chicago street race? Well, $50 million. They lost over 3 years. They lost on the Chicago street race, they say. So meanwhile, they say, hey, earlier you said that F1 you wrote in a document that F1 gives 50% of its revenue to the teams. And Scott Prime says, yeah, that was actually incorrect. I just Googled that. And they don't end up saying what the number is, though. They just say that was incorrect. So then Jeffrey Kessler on his redirect later comes back and says, you don't know what it is, do you? And he said, no, I don't know. But it's not, what I do know is it's incorrect because it's not a percentage. They don't give 50%. They give a certain number. He said, but you don't know whether that's more or less than 50%, do you? He admits he does not. So that part gets refuted. Anyway, he says they never considered taking the charters from teams. NASCAR negotiated in good faith. They said, did NASCAR negotiate in good faith? He says, I do. They said, do you think that it was a fair deal for the teams? I do, yes. And he also says he does not believe that Jim France had any ill intent here. He does not believe that Jim France, what Jeffrey Kessler accused Jim France of being in profit for himself and his family at the expense of the teams. Scott Prime says, one thing I've always heard it to be working here is just be good stewards of the sport. It's his life's and his family's work devoted to the sport. They want the next 60 or 70 years to be just as good. And so that's where the direct examination or the cross-examination ends, excuse me.
Yeah, a couple quick points. Scott Prime did make a note. NASCAR moved to the NextGen car not because of IP issues, and they were not trying to corner the market on cars so teams couldn't go race other cars. He also said, and this is I thought was noteworthy because we hear this a lot, NASCAR makes no money on single source parts. They don't get a piece of a percentage of any single source part out there. And it's actually written into the contract that they cannot make any money off of single source parts.
I'm glad you brought that up because I had missed that. If that was out there in the documents, I had missed that before. And he said that today, and I was very surprised because I thought all along NASCAR is probably getting a cut of all the next gen parts that are sold from the vendors, right? Wasn't that a common sort of
there's
thing?
There's a thought in the garage that NASCAR wets its beak, to quote my favorite movie.
Yeah. So, but Scott Prime says contractually we're not allowed to be getting any money from that. I thought that was interesting. I'm glad you raised that. So now we get back to some more fireworks, my friends, because Jeffrey Kessler is back and he says, you just talked about how Jim France is so humble and he camps out in a little RV behind the R&D center in Charlotte when he's there. Have you ever been to his house? He says, no. Have you ever known him to fly on a commercial aircraft? No. He says, how do you have?
Well, he said he didn't know. He said he didn't know if Jim flew on a commercial aircraft.
Well, and then he says, Jeffrey Kessler says that Jim France has flown exclusively on private.
But offered no evidence of that.
That's true. Says, well, then how do you have the basis to tell the jury he's not enriching himself if you don't know?
This is where I get frustrated.
Okay.
He's a businessman. My dad owns his own business. Like, if you own your own business, you're trying to make money. I mean, there's obviously a line of being greedy, but it's okay to be successful. It's okay to make money.
All right. So he also says, how do you know? You're saying that Jim chose path number 2, the path of working with the teams. You say it right here in this text is there's no bueno with Jim. Jim's not going to go for it. Scott Prime says that was just, again, that was a moment of frustration, one frustrating day, and that's not how ultimately everything evolved from his view. Okay. He also says, you said that you got mixed reactions from the teams. Well, here's an email that you sent to execs. You say you spoke to Steve Newmark for 15 minutes. And he says he thinks we don't quite appreciate the level of anger created when we sent out our draft. This was January 26, 2024. Mm-hmm. And Steve Newmark then quotes owners to Scott Prime. This is Scott Prime telling the executives what these owners said. One owner said, "This is the most one-sided document I've ever seen."
Mhm.
Another owner said, "This is absolutely criminal." Another one said, "Anyone who thought Jim France was going to be fair with us clearly is wrong," right? So now, he says, is there any owners who you talked to who thought this was a fair deal? And he again says Jeff Dickerson from Spire. Okay. Let's see, this whole part that ended up being irrelevant.
Yeah.
Right.
And then they disclosed the $50 million for Chicago street course race,
well,
which you already mentioned. And
then I will say that he said that the teams opposed just for the record, the teams opposed to the cost cap because a cost cap was proposed, and 3 teams don't want it apparently: JGR, Penske, and Hendrick, according to Scott Prime.
Which are the three
biggest teams who feel like they have a spending advantage, so they don't want a cost cap.
Yes, and they have the performance that, and that goes back to what we said earlier, which was the bigger teams tend to lose the most money. If they discovered over the years because they have more personnel, they spend more money in engineering and simulation and other things.
So they go back to I told you Scott Prime said, well, I didn't mean when I said lock up SMI tracks, I just wanted them on the schedule. For instance, TNT is our partner, okay? And TNT is important to us. We want to have a race at Atlanta, so we need to make sure that Atlanta's on our schedule. And Jeffrey Kessler says, well, you could have done an agreement with the SMI tracks without putting the exclusivity clause in there that says no other series can race there. And he says, well, that was what was agreed on. Scott Prime says that was what was agreed on with both parties, though. Jeffrey Kessler says, well, who wanted it in there? Not the tracks. And Scott Prime says, well, I don't know that. And Jeffrey Kessler says, has any track ever said, please, I want to be stopped from making money with other events? Scott Prime responds, I've never contemplated it. Jeffrey Kessler says, I don't think anybody's ever contemplated it.
Actually has. There's other people, and I was actually talking to somebody in the courtroom about this, and there is times where a third party could come in and say, hey, I want to race there, but I'm only going to race there if you exclude NASCAR. So there is a reason why they would want to put this in place.
All right. So ultimately they end up with another rehashing of the gun to the head stuff. And Jeffrey Kessler, gets him to say that, there was a deadline to the agreement. He says it wasn't a gun to the head, but he admits there was a deadline to the agreement. It was just an agreement that expired. Scott Prime says, Jeffrey Kessler says, what happened? He says they lost their charters, right? So that is the end of Scott Prime's testimony. Thankfully for Scott Prime, because I don't think he had a very enjoyable experience up there, Jordan. What do you make of the overall Scott Prime experience?
He looked, yesterday especially, not so much today, but yesterday he looked like a guy who went through the ringer. He looked like a guy who had been up there, been getting grilled for hours and hours, and had to kind of answer for a lot of things that maybe were even above him a little bit, and his boss's decision not to do things, in this case, Jim France. And he just looked, when he was all said and done, he just looked spent.
He definitely had to take the brunt of it's interesting because, right, like, why is he up there? He's not the Steve Phelps. He's not Steve O'Donnell. He's not Jim France. But he's the strategy guy.
Well, he is technically the strategy guy, but within NASCAR, he's known as the charter guy.
Okay, but here's what I think. I think that he had so much in writing because he's the strategy guy that they said, we're going to take you were the easy first guy for us to pull here because we have all these words of all your strategy. You're the one that laid out all this stuff. So what do you mean by this? He's a common thread through so many of these things, right?
Well, you have to build a case. You have to talk about charters. You've got to talk about the sanction agreements. If you're going to do that, this is a guy to pull in, kind of to your point of, like, he knows all this. You have to build. It's building a block. It's block on top of block to build your case. And so you can do that. And then the other thing is you're talking about charters, this is the guy most intricately involved in a lot of respects with the charters. He didn't write the first charter agreement, but he certainly had knowledge of it. And then over the years, he's become more and more involved. And he is, like I said, again, like when there's a charter sale, for example, like Scott Prime is heavily involved in this and like making sure everybody does all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted and that kind of thing. So he is an instrumental guy in this. And if you're going to be talking charters, you're going to have to be talking to him.
Well, we're finally on to witness number 3 of this case, which, by the way, witness number 3 still on the stand as we end day 3 here. But this is now we're moving on to Bob Jenkins, owner of Front Row Motorsports. Okay. Funny enough, Jordan, the man that really gets overlooked in this case, because all the cases about Michael Jordan and Denny Hamlin are suing NASCAR. But of course, Bob Jenkins is also right with them suing NASCAR. But it's like he's sort of been this afterthought, right? And this under the radar guy who he's just it's almost like he's just there too.
Yeah, he's in the background.
You know,
that's kind of how Bob wants it, though. Like
yeah, but that's what it's felt like, right?
I mean, yeah, it is. I mean, that's also how he wants it. Like, he doesn't want the media attention. He doesn't want to be in front of the cameras. He's somebody who doesn't even really communicate that much with employees. This is a guy who doesn't. We're going to get into it. Doesn't visit his race shop that often. You know, doesn't go to a lot of the races. Like, he talks to a couple people on the team on a regular basis, but that's it. He's just a very quiet, unassuming guy who likes to stay in the background.
Well, we start out by learning a lot about Bob Jenkins, which I thought was very interesting, Jordan. I don't know about you. But let's recap his story really quick before we get into his testimony, because I thought it was really interesting. Okay. Here's a guy who grew up in a housing project in East Tennessee. His dad worked in a factory, and then his dad would go bag groceries at night. Mm-hmm. Bob Jenkins' goal in life was to be the manager of a manufacturing plant, which he did by age 30. He ends up working for Taco Bell, and he ends up buying 2 Taco Bell stores with a 20% down payment in the year around the year 2000. Yep. He later, I'm sorry.
I was going to say we missed the biggest part here. He's a charter member of the Dale Earnhardt fan club.
No, I'm about to get there.
That's crazy. Like, he is a diehard NASCAR fan.
Right. So
diehard NASCAR fan, charter member of the Dale Earnhardt fan club.
He talks about how he used to drive with his buddy, who was a Darrell Waltrip fan, to races all over the South, and they would drive to these races. He had a closet full of Earnhardt shirts. He was. When you say a charter member of the Dale Earnhardt fan club, like literally the first year, he said he even talked to Kelly Earnhardt about this, that the first year of the Dale Earnhardt fan club, they had sent out these like little white boxes, only 100 or 200 of them back when Dale Earnhardt was not popular. And he has one, right? So he said he's the kind of race fan who gets all the appetizers put out before the Daytona 500, and he would get choked up when they say, start your engines. He absolutely loves NASCAR. He told his wife one time while watching a race that I'm going to own one of those cars out there on the track someday. His wife told him, we don't even own our own car yet. But this was something that he really wanted to do. And as he grew his franchise business, he now owns 400 Taco Bells, 50 Long John Silvers, and 30 KFCs from those 2 original Taco Bell stores.
Along with other business interests as well, plus some other restaurants.
He talks about how Jimmy Means, he was following the news. Jimmy Means lost his sponsor, Alka-Seltzer. Yep. He called Jimmy Means and said, can I sponsor you for Bristol? Right? This is my home race. Can I sponsor you? And Jimmy Means said, how much you got? They struck up a friendship, and he was sponsoring Jimmy Means for a while. They tried to do what they could. They ultimately went to Bristol as Means Jenkins Racing, tried to make their first race.
This was great.
They used their show car as the actual car, but his crew guy forgot to reattach the engine
hoses. You got the hoses and the engine blew.
The engine blew when they fired the car up for practice for their first race.
And he told the story in court today, and Denny and Michael laughed hysterically. Like, they both were like, they couldn't believe it. Like, it was an open, you could hear it in the courtroom, them laughing as Bob was telling the story.
So he goes on to talk about his Cup team ownership now, right? So he says he's proud to be known as the team that does the most with the least. It's fair, right? That's what we think of as for Front Row Motorsports.
They punch above their weight class a lot. They're very moneyball in that respect.
They are so cheap, though, Jordan. They're so frugal, I guess.
Frugal. Don't use the word cheap. Frugal.
Frugal. They're so focused on cost savings.
They are.
They bring their own ice to the racetrack.
Told me the story
to save money.
He told me the story, so I can tell the story. I think so. I was talking to Bob this year at Michigan, and we were talking about things kind of happening and everything. And I won't go into too much detail, but he looked at the ice behind there. He points. He goes, "You see that ice back there? That's my ice. We stop and buy the ice every week because I ain't paying for ice at the racetrack. They're not getting it from me. I'm stopping. It's cheaper this way."
It must be. So from that standpoint, Bob Jenkins says, you know what? It's offensive. When I was sitting in court here and I hear people talking about how the teams need to cut costs, that's offensive. So now we get into the charter system, and he talks. He's wheeled and dealed all these charters, and in fact, he's wheeled and dealed so many charters that he's made a total of $12.5 million off all his various charter leases, sales, all this stuff. Right? He says though, what you don't see is a lot of times I needed the money to get to the next season.
Yeah, he went into this. He said a lot of the charter sales that he was doing was November, December, because it's the off season, money isn't coming in, and they needed to figure out a way to get a revenue stream. So they would sell charters and be able to get the money and it'd get them to the next year.
Otherwise, he said sometimes he would lay off his employees for November, December. But anyway, he's asked, is the charter agreements fair? He said it's based on the belief someday they will be fair. So he goes into some of his financials here. He loses $6.8 million a year. He's never made an operating profit. 9 times this year, he ran a race with no sponsorship, and he refuses to run a blank car because he says that's been tried before and it does not go well. And so when he has a blank car, he says they have to wrap the car 1 week out.
Yep.
And if they get to 1 week out and they don't have a sponsor that's willing to pay, some minimum amount, which he doesn't want to do pennies because that's going to cause a problem for like Love's travel stops, right? Because then they'll say, well, how come you gave it away for this when we're paying this?
It undercuts your market. And he's not the first team owner, by the way. Rick Hendrick has said this. Other team owners have said too, is like, if you've got an opening and you're desperate to put a sponsor on there and you're like, hey, I'll just take your money. Your sponsor that's paying even more money is going to look at it and go, what am I doing here? Like, why are you giving them a deal and not me? And to Bob, and Bob's credit really quick too. Go ahead. You finish your things. It's going to go into that.
Well, so he has other companies.
Yeah.
So Dockside Logistics, when you guys see that on one of his cars, that's his company. MDS, I think it's a logistics, or that's a trucking company. That's a trucking company. That's on his car. And Long John Silver's, which comes out is owned. Long John Silver's is owned by Bob Jenkins.
Not just like
4 sons.
Yeah, not just like a couple franchises, like
the whole
brand
is owned by Bob Jenkins, 4 sons. He gave them millions of dollars of loans to buy this company. So they operate the company. That's a key detail for later coming.
You ever been to a Long John Silver?
I really don't think I have. Haven't we talked about this once on the podcast?
I don't think I'm not eating fast. I'm not eating seafood at a fast food restaurant like that. There's no offense, Bob.
So he again says he's had an operating loss every year. Like for instance, in 2022, he lost $8 million. In 2023, he lost $5.7 million. So they say, again, he's on direct examination now, not cross from NASCAR. They said, why keep going? He says, that sounds like something my wife would say.
He also does not earn a salary from Front Row Motorsports.
Never taken a salary from Front Row, he says. Yep. Now he gets into the NextGen car.
And this is where Denny Hamlin was nodding quite a bit.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm glad you noticed this. I did not notice that. So obviously he agrees that the NextGen was proposed as cost savings and a need to create more parity. But he said it was originally pitched as a $205,000 car, and it ended up being now Denny said $400,000 yesterday. For Front Row, he says $350,000 per car. Now he also says, when he says it costs $350,000 per car, that is not including the engine. That is not including the driver's salary. That is not including the pit crew. That is just for the car itself is $350,000 per race. And he says what's upsetting a little bit for him is pre-NextGen, he would spend $1.8 million a year on parts. Now he spends $4.7 million a year on parts, partly because you can't repair the parts yourself. He says, even if you're not in a wreck in a NASCAR race, it's going to cost you $30,000 in parts to go race that car again, because you got to send the nose back. You got to send stuff back that's not even wrecked.
He said even with like a little ding in any of the bumpers, in the bumper covers, any little bit of scratches or dings, you can't repair that yourself. That has to go back to where it came from,
the vendor.
And so you can't, even if you're not in a wreck, he goes, you're gonna have bumper damage. You can't race NASCAR without having some kind of bumper damage. You're gonna hit somebody. You're gonna bang into them a little bit. You're gonna scrape up your bumper, and that on by itself means it has to go back to where it came from. You can't fix it yourself.
I'm about to go to September 6th here, unless you have anything else. From
Yeah, I want to. Yes, I want to mention September 4th. We talked about contract negotiations and everything, and this is September 4th. NASCAR, the teams felt like they were getting into a good place. Depends on who you listen to. A small group of team owners, Bob said, including himself and Richard Childress. He did not name the other two, but it was I think there was 4. He said offered to fly to Daytona to talk to Jim one-on-one to kind of hash this out and figure this out and get this thing to the finish line. The answer was no.
Yeah, Jim did not want to meet with them, he said.
And that honestly hurt, is what he said.
So September 6th, no, he said the honestly hurt was the September 6th, I think. So September 6th, he's out to dinner with his parents. He's out of cell phone range. He gets back into cell phone range. He's blown up with text because he's found out they have to sign the charters at midnight or risk losing them. So that's when he says he feels honestly hurt. Joe Gibbs, he started calling his owner friends, Joe Gibbs, Richard Childress. He said Gibbs was honestly tough to listen to. He felt like he had to sign. He was worried he let me down, but he signed it. He said he had 5 or 6 conversations with other owners. None of them were happy to sign it, but he knew they had to blindly sign it or not because this was a Friday night. Lawyers were not on call on the East Coast. It was 6 p.m. when this, originally deadline was. Got extended to midnight.
He said, this is what he said. They knew there wasn't a law firm on the East Coast to read 112, 120 page document at 6 o'clock. And so he goes, they had us over a barrel.
Right. Now he says also he knew though, he understood that the other teams, they had all these hundreds of employees and hundreds of millions of dollars invested in shops and equipment and all this stuff. And he said they couldn't walk away from that. You can't turn a race shop into a warehouse. And so he says that the reason partly he didn't sign the deal was the deal went virtually backward in so many ways. It was insulting. It went so far backward. They got rid of that 3 strikes rule so that NASCAR could now rule the governance with an iron fist. He compared it to taxation without representation, Jordan.
Yes, that's founding fathers.
He then sat down with his 2 oldest sons. He told them, we're probably risking it all here. And he told them, listen, we're about to lose our charters. This is potentially your guys' future, right? He wanted to pass this team down to his family, right?
Yeah, he said, I don't know if this is true or not, but he said there has been no 3-car team. There was a multi-car team.
No multi-car team that has survived a generational transfers.
I don't know if that's true, but the Wood brothers, right? Well, they were not a multi-car team though, so I guess that's the caveat. Anyway, sorry.
It is interesting though.
It's got me thinking. I'm wondering. He may be right because Petty didn't have multi-cars really. He may be right.
So he's saying he wants to be the first. So he says, listen, if my sons had said, Dad, sign it, he said he probably would have, but they agreed with him that this was not okay. And, he talks about, he says, listen, this is nothing against the France family. I love the France family, appreciate what they've done for the sport. They've done so many good things, but this charter agreement is not one of them.
This is not bashing the France family.
Yes. And finally, before cross-examination, they again say that you've never profited though, right? In any year. And he says, I can assure you it's not from malpractice. We're very frugal. So he's tried to make it work, he says. Now comes the cross-examination from NASCAR. And I'll just start this, Jordan, by saying I think this was NASCAR's worst moment of the trial so far. I haven't really weighed in on legalese too much here or how things are going, but the way that this went, this cross-examination went this afternoon, I did not think was good for NASCAR. I think it came off, borderline distasteful. And I don't think the jury liked it. So let's talk about it, I guess.
I didn't see that from the jury. I don't know. I'm interested. We're going to talk to Shannon here in a little bit. I'm going to ask her about this is how much do you read into a jury at this point? I mean, this is really early in the trial. This is a 2-week plus trial. What is said now, does it get lost? When I looked over the jury, honestly, at the end of the day, they look bored. They look tired. They've been there all day. It's a lot of minutia they're having to wade through. I didn't see that reaction, but I can understand where it's coming from. Bob's a good man. He's very well respected in the garage, and the line of questioning could be considered that you're picking him apart and picking on him.
So he starts by, this is Larry Buterman, Lawrence Buterman, whatever. Lawrence.
Larry.
This is the one that cross-examined Denny yesterday and got Denny, fiery and emotional.
Larry has a very specific style.
So in this style, he talks about how Bob Jenkins only went to 12 races last year and only visited the race shop 6 to 8 times this season. He lives in Tennessee. So he and he doesn't really connect it, but I guess a lot of the things here he's trying to get the jury to pick up on stuff like, well, you say you're trying to make all these ends meet and stuff, but you're not even running the team, kind of thing. That's what I think he was saying that for, right?
This isn't your full-time job, which Bob acknowledged it wasn't.
Yeah. So then one thing, this is the one thing that I didn't like this. I'll just say I didn't think this was a way to go, and they spent a lot of time on this. So NASCAR is skeptical of Front Row's report that they've lost money, and to paint a picture to cast doubt over it, he talks about the Long John Silver stuff, right? It says Long John Silver's is owned by your 4 sons. You put them on your car 5 times this year, okay? So you are giving your children millions of dollars in free advertising, are you not? It says you're using your cars to boost your son's business. And this went on for probably 15 minutes.
It was a bulk of the thing.
It was a long time.
It's not over, by the way, because this is going to continue tomorrow.
So
this is building to something more.
Jenkins kept saying, this is not something I want to do. I want to have sponsorship, essentially. I'm doing this when I don't have a sponsor. I'm putting this on the car. And they say, yeah, but if you had charged your kids for sponsorship, okay, your money would have looked a lot better. Finally, Bob Jenkins says, okay, let's say I settled for $50,000 a race.
It goes back to what we said, which is then you're undercutting your bigger sponsors. And
no, but he's saying he's indicating that's what I would have taken.
And then it's not, their processes were so significant it was not going to do anything to make a difference, is effectively what he said.
Exactly. So what he says is, okay, let's say I even did charge my kids $50,000 a race, and that would have been 5 races. So that's a $250,000 impact on a team that lost $10 million, is what he says, right? So then they say, well, wait a minute now. Don't you have another business or something you started called Lakeway Christian Schools? So yes, I have Lakeway Christian Schools. Okay, isn't it true that you've tried to get some of your sponsors and drivers in their contracts to donate money to Lakeway Christian Schools that could have otherwise gone to Front Row? So instead of giving this money to Front Row, you had to go to your private Christian schools, right? So he brings up Matt Tiff's contract from 2019, $2.6 million contract. 500,000 of that was a donation to Lakeway Christian Schools. Well, Bob Jenkins says that never happened. He explains that, I guess Matt Tiff had raced for him before. He and his family had gotten to know each other, and they liked what he was doing with the schools, and they decided that as part of the deal, they were going to make this donation.
Part of the trust, yeah.
He didn't even know if he had charged that much, if that would have been the total deal. And Matt Tiff ended up getting the brain tumor, so he didn't race that year anyway.
He raced that year. It happened at Martinsville, and there was 3 races left in the year. It was Martinsville, Phoenix, and then Homestead.
So he says he never donated a single dollar to that school. In fact, he says no driver, sponsor, or team owner has ever made a single dollar donation to Lakeway Christian Schools. But again, NASCAR is doing this, trying to show you're showing a huge loss here, Front Row Motorsports. You're saying you lost all this money. Wait a second, that's not true. In fact, they say you weren't even audited, were you? He says, I think I was audited. Then they have testimony that's from his controller that says no, they weren't audited, right? So again,
but
Yeah.
It's create. I mean, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but this is what defense attorneys do. They create reasonable doubt. And if you create doubt of, wait a second, this guy doesn't have all these sponsors. Like, again, these are non-NASCAR fans. They don't know the intricacies of this. They don't get it. For us, this makes sense. You know, we understand why you don't run blank cars. We understand how this all works. But for a non-NASCAR fan, you're hearing this, you're like, oh, what is this guy doing? Like, he could be selling sponsorship, and he could be putting something on his car. And again, if you're the defense, you just have to create reasonable doubt, because all you need is one person out there in that jury box to say no. And that's what this is, right or wrong or indifferent. That is what they're working towards.
Sure, I totally understand that. Now, NASCAR also, this is probably a great point for NASCAR. This was refuted, though. They say, wait a minute, you're claiming openly to this jury that you've never made an operational profit in any year, yet you have sold $12.5 million in charters. So you're not counting the charter sales as part of your profit. And Bob Jenkins says, well, yeah, that's how you do the accounting, because he says, just like when I bought the $28.5 million charter from Stuart Haas, I'm not taking that as a loss. My operational profit, for my definition, is the steady year-to-year stuff, not did I sell a charter. But NASCAR is saying you can't claim that you never made a profit if you sold charters for a few $1 million, and then, you know, how can you not count that? So they argue about the charter system a little bit. Bob Jenkins has one quote where he says the charter system is good. He wants to clear up a misconception. The charter system is good. What we don't believe is good is the charter agreements.
It's an absolute win for the teams in the sport.
So now this was an exhausting back and forth as well about the splitting the hairs over.
And this is why I think you end up losing the jury a little bit, is because
this got boring.
It's hard on them.
So just to recap, essentially, Bob Jenkins says that, so NASCAR says, right, that the 2016, the original charters didn't cost the teams anything, right? Bob Jenkins says, you're right. We didn't pay for them
per se,
but the 2 years I had to run full time the 2 years before in order to get these charters, and I lost $8 million. So yeah, I didn't write a check for them, but I paid for them. I had costs, right? They weren't free for me. Is what he's saying.
He's effectively saying that he wrote that check in 2014 and 15, and then because he did that, he was able to get the charter in 16. It's a way to look at it.
So this goes back and forth. They're really splitting hairs here. They go back and forth. He tries to pull his deposition testimony. He says, you said this, and let me read this back to you. And Bob Jenkins keeps saying, yeah, I didn't pay for them, but they still cost me something. And, you know, Buterman, he was really trying to get them to say, NASCAR gave them to you for free, you know, because that is a big point for NASCAR, right? Like, they want to say,
we gave you this thing that is now worth X amount of dollars.
So now Buterman goes back to the same logic that he used with Denny Hamlin. If you have an exclusivity clause with your drivers, then why are you complaining about an exclusivity clause with NASCAR? So that, you know, we heard that as part of the cross-examination yesterday. Again, he said that's apples and oranges. We don't use it to protect a monopoly. Exclusive agreements are not illegal. It's when you use it to protect a monopoly. Then he says, well, wait a minute now. You're saying you think you were very, very underpaid when NASCAR was giving you guys 25% of the revenue. You only pay your drivers 8.5% of the revenue. And in fact, some of them pay to race for you. So how do you justify that? And Bob Jenkins says, you know what? It's not like other stick and ball sports. It's not like basketball, because you don't wreck a $350,000 basketball. And he says, you know, Buterman says, listen, you know, your own expert says, you know, what did he say? They're worth 60 something $million.
100.
He said they were worth 60 something $million. Front Row was, and that Front Row is seeking $140 million as part of this lawsuit. And so he's saying, how is that fair? The judge then said, are you close to wrapping up? Because it was going close to 5. He said no. And the judge said, my hopes are dashed. So that was the end of the jury part of this. Now we will get to one more part, and then we will bring in Shannon McMenemy, our legal expert friend, because she'll want to weigh in on this. The jury leaves the room, and the Judge Bell, who we told you is a no-nonsense guy.
But great sense of humor.
Yes. Oh, by the way, earlier, right after lunch, I don't have it. Oh, yeah. Right after lunch, we sit back in before the jury comes back in. And he says, there's been some new flurry of confirmations of district court judges in D.C., and they're looking for cases to give some of these new judges. I told them I'll just give them this one. And the whole courtroom laughed louder than I've heard. All the lawyers thought that was hilarious. I think that was a big lawyer joke. Anyway, so after the jury leaves for the day, Judge Bell says, twice today, the defense has violated orders of this court. He first brings up the Dickerson text, which he had said, don't say, this is hearsay. He says, that is unacceptable. The second one he says, so earlier we glossed over this, wasn't because they tried to go down this road and it didn't end up happening. NASCAR really wanted to get into the finances of Bob Jenkins' other companies to show that overall he was making money from his other companies and how much he was going to be making. Apparently that had been agreed, before the trial.
That was part of the Hendrick Penske thing as well. And they didn't want MJ didn't want people diving into his finances. And so this was all tied into this.
There was an agreement to not talk about money from businesses outside NASCAR. So the judge says, you made an attempt to get into non-NASCAR business revenues. These violations of court orders will result in serious downside, and they will not happen again. These violations of court orders will not happen again without serious downside for whoever commits them. I wrote it out of order on my thing. So he ends the day with a stern warning and says, court's dismissed till tomorrow, where we will pick up again.
By the way, he doesn't have a gavel. You notice that?
Does he need one?
You go to court, you're in federal court. I'd like to hear a gavel. I want the full effect. If I'm going to sit there for hours on end on his bench, I want to hear the gavel.
Well, it's time now, Jordan, to bring in
maybe she can tell us
our attorney friend, Shannon McMenemy, for the second straight night here and third time on the podcast. Shannon, you've been listening to everything we just talked about. Sorry, sitting there very patiently for minutes. And here you are now. So tell us, give us your impressions of today, what you've heard. We will hang up and listen.
You don't have to hang up, but I've been dying to get this information and to chat with you about it. I'm going to flip it and start at the end and work my way towards the beginning. No attorney ever wants to get scolded the way the NASCAR attorneys got scolded by Judge Bell. That is the thing that I joke about living in NASCAR Siberia, but I often joke if I ever had a federal judge talk to me like that, I would run away to Siberia because it never goes well. And Judge Bell has been very clear. I think he took the case over last February, January, whenever the other judge went senior status. He's been very clear about his expectations. And literally this was among the commentary about other people's business ventures and overall money they make was something that had clearly been addressed, as was Hearsay, as was Jeff Dickerson, which I'm assuming I have some guesses as to why Jeff Dickerson wasn't named by NASCAR, but to get that level of scolding is really bad. And what could happen to them? Well, they can be held in contempt of court. Typically, and I looked up the federal contempt power statute that allows for him to levy fines or put people in the pokey. He can basically put you in jail for contempt of court. And in this instance, where he has at times kind of not in front of the jury, obviously, but in prior hearings, reference the amount of money the parties are spending on this case, whatever he does has to be a viable deterrent. Finding somebody clearly not going to really make a difference in this case, right? It's like finding somebody $5,000 is not going to get them to not do something again. What I think would happen is he would start by whatever attorney did it would be excluded from the courtroom, meaning NASCAR has to work around that attorney. They're still on the case. They can still do work, but they do not get to do work in his courtroom because they can't follow the rules and the orders. And it could ratchet up to things like being found in contempt and being incarcerated, which is crazy. Like, it does occasionally happen in civil litigation. It's very, very rare, but it could happen. So don't make the judge mad. I hope they pick up what he was putting down and stop trying to push any boundaries, which circles back to my other question and theme of the day, unless you have something to comment on. Who are we seeing as attorneys and who aren't we seeing? Where'd Christopher Yates go?
He's there, but he's not doing the presentation.
NASCAR has completely changed the face of its case. They had one attorney do their opening, Stevenson. They've had Butterman do Denny and Bob, and then Anna Rathburn, found her name, Anna Rathburn, handled Scott Prime's examination. But it's all been Jeffrey Kessler for the teams, which
that's incorrect.
Okay, almost all. Who did?
They had a woman. I didn't catch her name today.
2 women.
Yeah, they've had 2 different women so far.
Do examinations?
What's that?
Do witness examinations?
Yes. The woman, Danielle Williams, was maybe today doing Bob Jenkins.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
On the direct. Kessler was doing the cross of Prime, right?
Okay.
Or no, he was doing the direct of Prime, I guess, because that was basically the cross.
Yep.
Right?
Direct and recross, whatever. But
and then Hamlin there, Kessler didn't do Hamlin.
No.
Okay.
They had a woman, I can't remember her name either. Sorry.
Okay. So I was curious to know that, but the disappearance of Christopher Yates in the case is really unusual.
Yeah, he's there, but he's not there. Like, he's very involved. He's sitting front row, and he's right next to whoever's asking questions, and he's certainly passing notes and other things along, but he is not actually actively.
I have to question if they did mock jury work and he tested poorly.
That's the word on the street.
Okay, so that would make sense to this one.
I can't confirm that, but that is the word on the street, is that mock and everything like that. It did not go maybe as well as they thought, and that's why the change.
Gotcha. Which would make sense. And I now I'll make sure to get the names of the other 2 teams attorneys who's done questioning.
Makes it easier,
right? And I'm going to work on a chart eventually that has everyone's names. But from all I gather, Jeff, it sounds like your perception of Bob Jenkins' cross-examination not going well for Mr. Butterman and NASCAR is shared by a lot of your colleagues who were in the courtroom. And when I get to my notes about his testimony, I don't think it went well for them. But stepping backwards, the gun to the head analogy that kept being used today immediately caused me to jump back to the summary judgment argument where Kessler said, if you're going to make Michael Jordan go buy an IndyCar team with a gun to his head, you better make it a big gun. Like, clearly the intention of that phrase had come up in the litigation, and they knew that they were going to be using it, and it was going to be another theme like documents don't lie. So it was a very intentional use. It sounds like you got to see a masterful examination with the dropping of things and then circling back. Part of the reason that you do that as an attorney is to not let the witness get into a rhythm and know what the next set of questions is if it is an adverse witness, right? So you want to get the points you want, but you don't necessarily do it in what would seem like a logical order to any of us watching or the witness, because you're also trying to not keep it logical for the witness. You're trying to make sure you're getting truthful answers from them where they're actually having to think about your question and answer your question, not predict what the next question is and start already thinking about their answer to shape their answer to fit the narrative that they think will help the case. So it sounds like you got that masterful cross-examination. Once we finally got into Scott Prime's background as the consultant who did the report from 2014, completely clear why he was the first witness. He has this big, long involvement in our sport is going to be ruined if teams don't do better. So that totally made sense to me once that piece came in as to why he was such an early witness. I am going to say that I completely disagree with him that you can have a permanent system that's not renegotiated. the whole concept of franchise law or franchises work that way, right? You have a franchise agreement, and then it gets amended over time as you need to change terms and conditions. So I'm going to agree that Bob Jenkins made the correct analogy in saying the charter concept and a charter system is different than the charter agreements. And you can negotiate agreements without giving up the concept of, or without, and have something that has a permanent value, a permanent ownership value. And that works in all kinds of businesses, television, franchise restaurants, basically everything that has an affiliate system. So I'm going to push back on his answer on that one. Also, 100% Jeffrey Kessler knows that Jim France only flies private. You don't ask that question.
Oh, yeah. And he definitely did. He just didn't present evidence to say it, though, which I thought was interesting.
You're going to ask that of Jim France if you need to, but you'd never take the risk to ask that question if you didn't know the answer. It sounds like one of the other pieces of testimony that really resonated with me was his comment about assuming that somebody had vetted the numbers, that the $120 million number would bankrupt NASCAR, and the CFO saying that, I'm curious to know if anyone's ever going to testify to actually running numbers on that. Or did they just take a perception? And this is something I've experienced in working in entities where the CFO or the COO says something, but nobody ever runs the numbers to see if they're right. And they don't even know. They're just making an off-the-cuff comment that suddenly becomes a touchstone of your entire organization where, Susan said the one time that we would be bankrupt if we agreed to it, and nobody ever checked the numbers. So I'm going to be really interested in seeing if that ever comes back around to somebody from NASCAR saying we vetted this.
I want to ask you about the Bob Jenkins cross-examination.
Oh, Bob's my winner of the day.
Yes. So the perception is it didn't go well, right? The jury was didn't feel for it, right? I'm curious, though, in a long trial like this, we're on day 3 of a trial that's going to go 2+ weeks. There are going to be countless more witnesses, right? So,
but how many of them are going to sit at counsel table for the rest of the case? Part of why I think Bob's cross-examination went poorly is because I think his direct examination went really, really well in how he presented himself, right? The story he told, why is he in NASCAR, who he is as a person, is appealing. His business, his son's business that by the way, they bought Long John Silver in 2022. The name of the corporation that bought that, 4 Oaks, for his 4 children. He's planting the 4 oaks to grow over time. Like, there's just some really easy to resonate. It doesn't matter to me who you are as a person, but with regards to what type of business, Jordan, you referenced your father being a business person. My parents owned a trucking business together. Everybody understands the concept of wanting to do something that sets up your children to have a better life than you. And he was the witness who gets to tell the story as an owner in a way that is more folksy and less combative than Denny Hamlin's testimony was. And I think that just the way he described his involvement in the sport, slipping in that some would call me a redneck comment, chef's kiss, because especially knowing that Richard Childress is going to be a witness, whether those text messages ever come in or not, those small things about I'm a guy from the projects of Tennessee, essentially, who's built myself this great career. I'm not this multi-billionaire family that's just got generational wealth and seems to be holding tight to extreme generational wealth. I also thought, the story about him being frugal, that's a nice word, Jordan. We'll go with frugal instead of cheap, even though it sounds like he described himself to you as cheap when it came to buying ice, is one of those other things that really resonates against that narrative of people who the teams spend too much money. What are the teams who, if you gave them no cap, would essentially blow out all their money? Well, 2 of them are the teams that NASCAR is relying on the owner to come in and provide testimony that is critical to them. Like NASCAR's identified that they think Roger Penske and Rick Hendrick are critical witnesses. so critical they chucked him on the witness list super last minute. But now they're going to come in after the jury has heard from somebody like Bob, who is running his organization close to the bone, and going, wait a second, these are the guys who didn't want caps because they already have all the money. Okay, makes sense. So I thought that he kind of they were able to strategically use his testimony to anticipate the differences between Front Row Motorsports, Hendrick Motorsports, and Penske, knowing the importance that NASCAR has put on to testimony from Rick Hendrick and Penske. Also, I really don't think his cross-examination, circling back to wouldn't the teams do better if you were in the garage more? The man owns fast food franchises. I don't know what he's going to do in a garage to make his cars go faster.
You had a Long John Silver's ever?
Okay, Bob, if you're listening, I'm going to apologize in advance. I have a rule. If I don't see water, I don't eat seafood. Period. No, not going to happen. Though I did quickly see that Long John Silver's expanded their menu to include chicken and would now like to be known as a chicken.
Now they're ruining it. No, that's like hamburgers being at Chick-fil-A.
Right. But I think that I think that the jury would understand, of course, this guy being at the garage is not going to make the cars go faster. If anything, it's going to take the employees away from doing the work that might get him faster cars. So I can see how that line of questioning kind of bombed out. And I think the juxtaposition of Denny, then Bob, where we still haven't seen Curtis Polk or Michael Jordan. Poor Curtis Polk's probably lonely and sad that he doesn't get to know what's going on yet. I hope he's getting an entertaining rundown in some way, shape, or form. But those are two really different backstories in how somebody became a NASCAR owner. And I think that Bob's story is appealing and makes him an empathetic plaintiff. And coming in hard and trying to pick on him about things like going to the garage more doesn't seem like a good use of your time. I think that Butterman's tactic and strategy worked better with Denny, who is a more confrontational person who's going to jibe back, because then it looks like, he's just holding his own with a snippy guy. Whereas I think kind of there's this, were you picking on this guy who seemed to, have emotion about the right things by taking jabs at weird things that don't seem to have anything to do with the topic at hand. I think they got to back off the whole, isn't this analogous to signing a driver? It didn't work. It's not working. Come up with some different questions, because at the end of the day, that doesn't matter to the overall question the jury's going to have, which is NASCAR using its position of power unfairly towards the team? So I would definitely abandon that and try and start picking more holes into the broader picture, as opposed to trying to say, nanny, nanny, boo, boo, you do it too.
Shannon, my last question for you is, both sides tried to impeach witnesses today, both unsuccessful.
Yeah, it's hard to do it correctly.
So they tried to impeach Scott Prime. It didn't work. And then they tried to, so Bob Jenkins, I guess Jamie Averett from the marketing department had testified that Ford only paid $90,000 out of a supposed $1.175 million sponsorship. And it ended up like the evidence got sort of jumbled, and they ended up overruling it. Like it didn't, I don't know what happened, but first of all, what is, if they impeach a witness, does that mean their testimony is excluded? What does that exactly mean? And then second of all, are both sides going to try to impeach every single witness? Is that what's going to happen here?
I mean, it's basically trying to say you lied here, you lied here. Are you lying here? If you lied here, which is the truth and which is, if you said this then and you're saying this now, were you lying then or were you lying now? But it only ever really works if you're confronting somebody with a sworn statement under oath that is directly contradicting what they've said in court. The better tactic is to have them get the testimony, get the contradiction in the record, and then circle back in your closing and say, remember when I told you documents don't lie? Let's talk about when Scott Prime told you X and then 3 hours later told you Y. And then you pull up those quotes and you put them on the screen, because they should be able to have visuals for their closing arguments, because that's when they can make the argument. And you tie you put the bow on it yourself. You don't leave it up to the judge to decide if a person has been impeached or not. And frankly, all it just means is like, you can admit some exhibit that helps prove that they just lied on the stand right now. It just goes to credibility. And you can attack a witness's credibility just as effectively by getting them to make those contradictory statements. You don't confront them about it, but then you circle back around when you do your closing and say, remember when so-and-so said X and then 2 hours later said Y? And you put the direct quotes up there. You say, which time do you think they were telling the truth? Let's look at this document. Oh, they were telling the truth when they said this, because that's what aligns with this document. So I don't think it's a great tactic to impeach. The only times I've ever done it is where somebody was just blatantly being untruthful and I had the document and I just wanted to get the document admitted as an exhibit after the exhibit deadline. Because you can get if you're properly impeaching somebody, you can get basically the document that proves the impeachment into the record, even though it wasn't submitted ahead of time. And one last thing on the whole, like, you let your sons run sponsorship for free, all of that business. I think we'll probably hear, now knowing that it's Richard Childress, Cal Wells, you know, who the other people who are going to testify are, who are owners.
Richard Childress, Steve Newmark, Roger Penske, Rick Hendrick.
I'm sure one or more of them is going to get asked a question about, is it better to run a blank car or a car that, like Rick Hendrick, all the times the Hendrick motor scheme is used, why are you doing that? Is it just to promote your car, or did you not have a sponsor and you didn't want to run an empty car? So I think that will come back around and could potentially make the jury lose some trust in Butterman if he kept hammering a point with Bob Jenkins that the witnesses that NASCAR puts on down the road ultimately make as well or agree to. And I will give, and I said this online and I'll say it again, I think it was smart of Bob Jenkins to say NASCAR has, the France family has done a lot of good in this sport. And because if you come into this where you've had a decade or longer business relationship with the other side, and you're like, they're pure evil, they've never done anything right ever, that's not realistic. That's not how people do business. You don't stay in business with people you super duper hate for 10 years unless you have some really compelling reason. So I think to acknowledge, like, they've done a lot of good they do a lot of good things. This here right now is not a good thing. So he's my winner of the day. The loser of the day is the NASCAR attorneys who got scolded, because you never want to get scolded by a federal judge. Now, the jury doesn't know that, right? The jury doesn't know they got the talking to. But personally, as an attorney, that would just make me want to curl up into a ball and cry.
What happened to the gavel? Why doesn't Judge Bell have a gavel?
Okay, so Judge Bell is fascinating me with some of his courtroom choices. Jeff told me yesterday that he is having the attorneys ask questioning seated at the table, which takes away an attorney's power. And that is totally unusual. And I love it because it's also preventing the attorneys from wandering over to the jury and standing in different places in the courtroom to exude power and control subtly with their body dynamics. And it's making it clear that there is one person in control of this courtroom, and his name is Judge Bell. So I think
let's get him a gavel.
Maybe he just thinks that that's overkill. Maybe he doesn't need a gavel because he controls his court by having attorneys keep themselves seated.
There you go.
I have to tell you, I had a mediation today, and so that took care of my big work obligation for the week. And I have a meeting tomorrow morning, and I have to keep reminding myself it's irresponsible to fly to Charlotte. Right now, what's keeping myself here is my little cousin is playing in the state football championship on Saturday. But if we haven't heard Richard Childress or Michael Jordan by...
You're flying out here? Oh, my God.
I'm gonna like have to put the dog. I'm gonna have to find a dog sitter, and I'll magically show up Monday morning and be like, "Hey, everyone, nice to finally see you."
Oh my gosh! Well, we could have you in the studio then.
And by studio, you mean your hotel room?
Yeah. Well,
He's got an extra hideaway bed or whatever the hell they call it.
our
Full up couch.
Jordan, but
I'm
I
not
also
sure.
have a fun piece of information because somebody asked me online, and I think listeners might like to know this. How much is the jury getting compensated for their time? $50 a day. $50 a day for days 1 through 10. $60 a day for every day after. They get reimbursed for actual mileage for the practically shortest route. And that's because federal district courts can be really big, like the districts themselves. Like sometimes it's 2 hours to the courthouse. So they get reimbursed for that. They get reimbursed for like toll, ferry, bridges. It's at the court's discretion if they get reimbursed parking.
Well, parking's very expensive around here, so.
So yeah, I hope Judge Bell's letting them get the parking, because otherwise that $50 a day is probably going to be spent parking.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Shannon, again, and we'll probably be talking to you tomorrow or the next day or sometime soon. Everybody, thanks.
Until I creepily show up in the courtroom on Monday, and you're like, "Hey,
right. Everybody, thanks for listening once again. Probably the longest podcast the entire year. We will talk to you
after your commitment to be shorter, which apparently was you made a commitment to be shorter, and it was then resoundingly rejected.
Everybody rejected it. All right. See you guys tomorrow. Talk to you later. Bye.